Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking episode 1 of season 4 of The Walking Dead called 30 Days Without an Accident. And overall, I feel this is a pretty alright episode. It just suffers from the problem that so many season premiere episodes suffer from, is that you've got to show people where all the pieces are on the board at this time. Usually things from seasons tend to, unless things ended on a cliffhanger, usually there's always some time that has passed. And on drama shows, that means when the show comes back for the new season, like I said, you got to spend some time showing people and getting them up to speed, reminding them of everything that's happened, and basically making sure that everybody is on board with the new status quo and start moving things forward from there. And all in all, I think this episode does a pretty solid job of that. Now, one thing that I've noticed when I was reading about interviews with the creators of the show when they were talking about the upcoming season is they said that they really wanted to focus in not so much on a single threat, so much as reminding people that the walkers are not a manageable problem. And from what we've seen in the last 3 seasons, we've seen that as long as our heroes are reasonably careful and well prepared, they're going to be okay against the walkers. And one of the things the creators said they wanted to do this season was to remind us that the walkers are not a manageable threat, is basically the quote that they used. That they are a force of nature at this point, in a way. That, kind of a way to think of it is, imagine a place like Holland or Denmark. Countries that are built very close to sea level. Countries like that basically wouldn't exist if they didn't have those systems of dams and dikes. Well, imagine the walkers as the ocean on the other side of those dams and dikes. Unless those are maintained meticulously, that if there's even a small mistake, it could potentially lead to disaster. Could potentially lead to who knows how much being wiped away, lost in a flood, washed away, destroyed. And that's a good way, in my mind, to think of the walkers. In the United States, currently, there are about 330 million people. Now you have to imagine in the Walking Dead universe, the vast majority of those folks are either dead or walkers. So, now, well, granted, not all of those folks are roaming around rural Georgia, but there are enough. And we've seen what herds are like. We've seen what enough walkers can do. Or have we? Because I have the feeling that this season we're really going to get to see what a lot of walkers can do up close and personal. So anyway, let's kind of get right into things in a little bit more detail. Now, speaking of having loads and loads of walkers, one thing that I really like in this episode is that we get to see people along the fences going grr, 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 with that. Now, when I was reading the Walking Dead comics, for some reason, this was just something that I absolutely loved. I can't offer you a real reason why. It just seemed like such a nice touch, such a smart touch, something that just makes so much sense. I don't know, maybe this is just sort of kind of reminds me of when I was a little kid and I'd get my evil little kid jollies stomping on ants. Thankfully, I did grow out of that, but I suppose there's some elements there that are similar. But as we've seen, that man, even though they're out there doing that every single day, it doesn't really seem to be making a dent. It's barely keeping the tide at bay. And they even comment on that it's actually getting kind of a pain to distract the walkers away from the fences long enough for them to get rid of the bodies of the ones that they've killed. Now, is it just me, or does it seem like really odd that just so many walkers are homing in on this one little area? I mean, Herschel's farm had to have been bigger than the prison, and there was never this much of a problem with walkers there. I mean, granted, they had to go out and deal with them, but still, not so much. Now, granted, you have a lot more people. They obviously have to be making a lot more noise and all this other stuff. But still, doesn't it just seem a little bit disproportionate? You gotta wonder. You gotta wonder. Anyway, so let's start talking about our characters. And we might as well start off with our main guy, Rick. And the whole thing with Rick this episode and the Irish lady is basically Rick getting to see another example of what he could have ended up if he hadn't had the other people around him in his little band of survivors to pull him back. Now that's all well and good, but we've already kind of really got hammered with this idea last season. We saw poor Morgan, who was basically an example of Rick in crazy survivalist mode. We saw the governor as evil Rick, and here we have this poor Irish lady as, zombie obsessed Rick. This is what Rick could have got. Rick could have ended up if he'd been not been able to somehow get past Laurie's death as much as he had. Not that he's done a super good job of that, but Rick's at least functional. I gotta say though, if I can imagine if things had not gone quite the way that they had, that it could have been Rick walking around with zombie Laurie's head somewhere, babbling to it. And if you're familiar with the Walking Dead universe, this Irish lady, she ain't the first person to be walking around with their zombie spouse's head in a bag. And if you've played the Walking Dead video game, you know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, there is that. Although I gotta say though, I sort of do disagree with Rick's decision to not make sure that the Irish lady didn't reanimate, because, hey Rick, that's one more zombie out there that could potentially eat you and your friends and family. And for the love of God, put that poor woman's husband out of his misery. I mean, geez, Rick, how big of a jerk are you that you won't even put some guy who's a head in a bag out of his misery? Jeez, I mean, look at how big a jerk Shane was, and you at least made sure he got put out of his misery. Not cool, Rick. Not cool. The Irish have suffered enough. Oh God. Oh man, that was an extraordinarily poor taste on my part. I do apologize. I just could not resist that one. Yeah, sorry folks. Sorry. Man, I haven't even been drinking tonight. I guess it's just one of those days, huh? Anyway, so we might as well continue talking about the Grimes family. And in a stark contrast to Season 2, Carl is actually right now a pretty interesting character. I'm really interested in what's going on with Carl, and that's not just because I know kind of what lies ahead for him in the comics. What we've got here with Carl is a really interesting contrast. One, they even mentioned, and we see Carl getting all geeky and excited when Michonne brings him some comics. And I believe it was Rick even mentioned him reading comics early in the episode. But then later on, when we see Carl talking to the other kids and reminding him, like, hey, don't give the walkers nicknames, don't stand there and taunt the walkers, we see that Carl's still got that hard edge to him. He's still got that, I don't know if you exactly want to call it darkness in him, but Carl is a kid growing up in this world. Well, it's not exactly correct to say dog-eat-dog world, but you get my drift. And we're starting to see in this episode some real hints as to what the future for the human race really entails. And what we're seeing, I think, is really an example of Carl becoming the kind of guy, the kind of Rick of that world. What that kind of world is going to need in order for people to survive. Now, better than anyone, even those other kids, Carl, I think, knows just how bad the walkers can be. And you got to think, back to Season 2, taunting that walker is essentially what led to Dale getting killed. So it's no wonder that Carl's going to go and take a pretty hard line there. And speaking of, people growing up in this world, let's take a look at Beth. Beth, it's kind of cute at the beginning of the episode where Beth doesn't wish her new boyfriend goodbye. But when Daryl comes to her afterwards and tells him that Zach, that's the guy's name, is dead, Beth just kind of shrugs it off, takes down that little sign, down to 0 days without an accident. And even Daryl is kind of a little creeped out by all of this, and she explains to him, I don't cry anymore. And then she gives him a hug. And you can just see it in Daryl's expression, that he is profoundly disturbed by this. It's not something that he can probably articulate, but you have to think that on some level, Daryl realizes that in the world that's taking shape, Beth has a real chance of growing up to be a harder person than him. Imagine that. Cute little Beth, a harder person than Daryl Dixon. But we're all the products of our environment. We're all the products of our circumstances. And no doubt about it, Daryl Dixon's a guy who had it tough growing up. But he didn't grow up in a world that was filled with flesh-eating zombies, where other living people are almost as much a threat to you as these horrible monsters that so much of the human race has turned into. Should he really be surprised that the people, the next generation, are going to be even tougher than he is and the other survivors in order to live in this world? He really shouldn't be. But that's a realization that's just now dawning on Daryl. And you can see, even he's pretty creeped out by this. What kind of world is it? What kind of world is it that these kids are growing into? What kind of people are these kids growing into? What kind of people are these good kids, Beth and Carl, turning into? What kind of person is Judith going to turn into? You gotta wonder. Anyway, nothing really particular to say about Herschel. He does get to give Rick a nice little speech, because Herschel's good at that sort of thing. But we'll talk more about what Herschel said there later on. Nothing really particular to say about Carol, but given her background, her husband being abusive and all of that, and the loss of Sophia, it really does make perfect sense that, regardless of what Rick thinks, that Carol really would be willing to take this line that she has in wanting to teach these kids about knives and how to fight and defend themselves. Because no way does Carol want to see another kid lost. No way does she want to see that happen. No way does she want to see these kids become another Sophia. Let me see here. One thing that's interesting is they mentioned that the prison is now, in accordance with Rick's wishes, a democracy. It's run by a council. Daryl is one of the members, and so yeah, I do like that. I do like that Rick was good to his word. Now, moving on. One thing that I do want to say is that I was really excited when I was watching the opening credits to see that Kyle Gallner was on this episode. I was like, oh, hey, Kyle Gallner, I really like him. I've seen him on Veronica Mars and on Smallville, and guest appearances he's done on Law and Order. He's a really talented guy. I always enjoy it when I get to see him. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I knew that I'd read about some of the people that they were adding to the cast this season, and Kyle Gallner wasn't one of them. I'm going to bet his character doesn't make it out of this episode. And sure enough, poor Zach did not make it out of this episode. Although, man, it's a wonder anybody made him out of that store. I have to say, that whole thing with it raining zombies, oh man, that was just absolutely epic. Now, granted, it's a little questionable whether or not the roof of what's basically a Walmart could support a helicopter, or why people would be so gung-ho to go into a building that has a helicopter, on the roof that's, from the look of it, probably about to collapse at any time. But, needs must when the devil drives, right? But again, yeah, just when the zombies are falling in and the way they're crawling around and the skin is tearing off, like, oh man, that is horror gold, people, horror gold. And what was happening with Bob being pinned, and of course Zach's rather unpleasant death. Woo-hoo! Yeah, I'm sure some folks out there had some nightmares watching this one. That's how you do it, folks. That's how you do scary. And speaking of the walkers, is it just me, or do the walkers seem a little bit more on the rotted side? Now that, well, it's a little unclear exactly how long it's been since the outbreak, but if I'm reading the timeline right, we're looking at least a year and a half, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 years. So, I guess maybe it's not so surprising that they're looking a little worse for wear, but still, we see like their skin is always peeling off, and a lot of these guys, like, just pressing up against their skulls hard will cause them, like, your fingers to go into their brains, and it's really, really, really gross. But yeah. And I think that this is actually something the show is also subtly trying to allude to. Because if you pay attention, there is kind of a theme of decay in this episode. We see the pig dying, and it's just out there in the pen. When Rick finds the Irish woman, he as he's hunting, as he's about to encounter her, he sees a deer carcass with flies swarming all over it. And later on, we see the dead body of a spider with flies swarming all over it. We're all something's meat. Remember when Carl said that? Or we're all something's meat? Astute little guy, Carl, isn't he? So anyway, another thing to talk about in relation to the pig, actually, is what happened to the nerdy dude, Patrick, where he gets sick, he goes off to the showers, and then mysteriously dies for some reason, and the last thing we see is him reanimating as a walker. Well, I was thinking, like, well, okay, what could it be? And I kind of wondered, since we saw that the pig died, like, are they actually going to go down the route and try and pass it off as swine flu? So, just for the heck of it, I looked up swine flu on Wikipedia, and apparently since the 50s, there have only been like 50 cases of swine flu being transmitted to humans. And there were only 6 cases of those being fatal, and 2 of them were people who were already had weakened immune systems for various reasons, and the other 4 were perfectly healthy people. So I guess swine flu is theoretically a possibility, but it seems extraordinarily unlikely that would be what would kill Patrick. Now, granted, we're also dealing with television, which is not well known for always sticking to accurate medical science. I think they'll just be like saying, oh, Herschel go like, oh, he was killed by swine flu. And they're like, oh, swine flu, yeah, that can kill people. Whatever. It's television. It's the nature of the beast. Let's see. Not a huge amount to say about Michonne this episode. After considering that, though, that Andrea has passed away, it's not unreasonable to think that Michonne is seriously itching for some payback on the governor. Now, in the comics, she had very different reasons for wanting payback on the governor, but we'll not talk about those because that's some serious spoiler territory and also seriously messed up stuff that I just really don't feel comfortable talking about. Yeah, I'll insult the Irish, but I won't talk about things from comic books that I found kinda disturbing. I'm a prince among men, aren't I, folks? Huh? Don't you just want to slap a crown on my head? Send a bunch of British tabloid journalists to harass me wherever I go? Actually, after my crack about the Irish, some of you probably wouldn't mind wishing that horrid fate upon me. You are cruel and soulless people if you do so, because I did apologize for that. And unlike most people on the internet when offering apologies, I was genuinely being sincere. I would also like to take this moment to remind you that I am, in fact, at this moment, 100% sober. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is how my personality is all the time. Yep. It ain't easy being me, but somebody's got to do it. It's just water. Just water, I promise. Okay, so anyway, let's get into one of the things that I wanted to talk about. And that was Hershel's speech to Rick about how you get to come back. What an interesting speech. Especially when he's talking about the crazy Irish lady. Well, here's the thing, Herschel, in case you weren't paying attention to the prologue. In the Walking Dead universe, pretty much everybody gets to come back. Some people, the lucky ones, they get to come back like Rick did, relatively sane. Some people go to a place and they come back from that place changed. Morgan and the Irish lady came back crazy. The governor came back evil. And most people in the universe, they just come back snarly, hungry, and rotting. The people who don't get to come back, the people for whom it really is permanently lights out, those are the lucky ones. Those are the ones who are at peace. Everybody else, they only wish they could go there. Maybe it's to something better in the next world. Maybe it's just good old-fashioned oblivion. But in this world that Carl and Beth and Judith and all those other kids are going to grow up in, peace, any kind of peace, even the peace of death, is going to be a rare thing. It's a peace that Patrick didn't get. It's probably, if he's lucky, that helicopter crushed him. And it's a peace that Zach might have got, if he's lucky. But as I said, that kind of peace is going to be a serious luxury in this new world. This new world that Judith and Carl and Beth and all the other children, including the children that Andrea and Glenn might have someday, that Maggie and Glenn might have someday, that kind of peace is going to be a very rare thing. And if it's a world where that kind of thing is rare, is that really a world that anybody wants to grow into? Is that a world anybody wants to live in? If you ask me, if that's the way of the world, maybe you have to make your own peace. But that's just me. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got for you this time. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and of course you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Till next time, take care.